Today, you'll discover the hidden Parkinson's symptom that's destroying relationships in millions of homes and how to recognize it before it's too late. This isn't about shaking hands or slow walking. This is about something far more devastating that most families never see coming. Meet Linda Martinez, 63, from Phoenix. 3 months ago, her husband woke up with chest pain but could only whisper. After asking, "What?" 4 times, he just stopped talking. That morning almost ended their 38-year marriage. This communication breakdown is happening right now, and families are getting angry at symptoms they don't even know exist. I'm Dr. Ellis Grant, family medicine physician with 30 years treating Parkinson's families. This is Health SOS, real people, real warnings. Linda's about to tell you what her husband's whispers were really trying to say, and why understanding this could save your family.
6 months ago, I was sitting at this kitchen table, looking up divorce lawyers on my phone. After 38 years of marriage, I was ready to leave my husband. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I couldn't live with someone who refused to communicate with me.
Linda, Parkinson's disease steals voices before it steals movement. Let's go back to that morning when everything unraveled. Tell me about the chest pain incident.
Tuesday, 6:30 a.m. Robert woke me saying something about his chest, but I could barely hear him. He was whispering so softly I thought he was trying not to wake neighbors. I kept asking, "What? What did you say?" Each time I asked, his voice got quieter. Finally, he stopped talking and sat there looking at me like I was the problem.
How long had you noticed this quiet speech pattern?
8 or 9 months before that morning. But here's what frustrated me most. Some days he spoke perfectly normal. We'd have regular conversations over breakfast, talking about grandkids, making plans. Then the next day, I'd strain to hear him order coffee at a restaurant. I started thinking he was doing it on purpose.
On purpose?
I know how that sounds now, but it felt like he was testing my patience or punishing me. When I'd ask him to speak up, he'd get quieter or stop talking entirely. Robert was always stubborn. 30 years as an electrician, military background. I thought this was his way of controlling conversations or showing he was upset.
This is one of the most common misunderstandings in Parkinson's families. The inconsistency, the quieter response when asked to speak up. These aren't behavioral choices. They're neurological symptoms. But few families are warned about this during diagnosis.
Nobody told us about voice changes. When Robert was diagnosed 2.5 years ago, we talked about tremors, medications, physical therapy. The neurologist mentioned speech might be affected down the road, but made it sound like something that would happen much later.
So you were dealing with something that felt personal and intentional, without knowing it was a symptom of his disease.
Exactly. And it was destroying our marriage. I'd get angry at him for things I thought he could control. When he'd whisper during important conversations, discussing his medication schedule, or when our daughter called, I felt like he was dismissing me, like I wasn't worth the effort of speaking clearly.
Tell me about your daily interactions during that period.
Mealtimes became silent. We used to talk about everything, kids, neighbors, what we watched on TV. But when every conversation required me to say, "What? I can't hear you," we both gave up. He'd retreat to his garage workshop, and I'd spend evenings alone in the living room. We were living like roommates who barely tolerated each other.
This isolation affects millions of couples dealing with Parkinson's voice changes. You mentioned some days were better than others. Did you notice patterns?
That's what made it confusing. Sometimes in the morning, after he'd taken his Parkinson's medication, his voice would be strong and clear. We'd have wonderful conversations that reminded me of the Robert I married. But by afternoon or evening, especially if he was tired, the whispers would start again. I thought it was mood-related.
You were observing dopamine fluctuations without knowing it. The medication temporarily improved his voice, but as it wore off, neurological symptoms returned. You were watching his brain chemistry change throughout the day.
I wish someone had explained that then. Instead, I spent months feeling guilty for being frustrated with a sick man, but also feeling abandoned by someone who seemed to choose when he wanted to talk to me.
For viewers recognizing their own family situation right now, understand that what Linda experienced is completely normal. Voice changes in Parkinson's can appear years before other symptoms, and they're often the most emotionally difficult for families to navigate. If you're seeing these patterns in someone you love, don't assume it's behavioral. There's a medical explanation, and there are solutions.
But that morning with the chest pain, that was my breaking point. I couldn't tell if he was having a heart attack or indigestion because I couldn't understand what he was trying to tell me. After he stopped talking, I sat there thinking, I can't live like this anymore.
What happened next that morning would change everything Linda thought she knew about her husband's condition. In Parkinson's, dying dopamine cells control speech muscles. When dopamine drops, patients lose the ability to gauge how loud they're speaking. Robert's brain told him he was speaking normally when he was actually whispering.
I had no idea. All I knew was that Tuesday morning, when Robert said something about chest pain, I couldn't understand him. When I kept asking him to repeat himself, he got quieter each time until he finally stopped. The look on his face, it wasn't stubbornness, it was defeat.
Tell me exactly what happened after he stopped talking.
I panicked. Here's my husband who has a history of heart problems, trying to tell me something about chest pain, and I can't understand what he's saying. I grabbed his arm and said, Robert, I need you to speak louder. This could be an emergency. He looked at me and whispered something that sounded like, I am speaking loud, but I could barely hear it.
That response shows exactly what was happening neurologically. Robert genuinely believed he was speaking loudly.
I didn't know that then. I was scared, frustrated, and felt completely helpless. So I made the decision for both of us. I called 911. While we waited for the ambulance, Robert sat on the bed's edge, not saying a word. I kept trying to get more information, asking about the pain when it started, how bad it was. Nothing. He'd just point to his chest and nod or shake his head.
How did the paramedics handle the communication issue?
They couldn't understand him either. One EMT leaned down close to Robert's face and asked me, Is he always this quiet? I felt embarrassed and angry. I said, Sometimes. But inside, I was thinking, no, he chooses when to talk normally and when to whisper, and apparently he's chosen to whisper during a medical emergency.
What happened at the hospital?
Acid reflux, not a heart attack. The doctor prescribed something and sent us home. But during 3 hours in the ER, I had to translate everything for medical staff because they couldn't hear Robert's responses. I felt like his interpreter rather than his wife.
That's incredibly isolating for both partners.
The drive home was completely silent, not just because Robert was being quiet, but because I had nothing left to say. I was exhausted from trying to communicate, exhausted from guessing what he needed, exhausted from feeling like I was failing as a wife because I couldn't understand my own husband.
What went through your mind that day?
I kept thinking about our daughter calling the night before. She'd been trying to have a conversation with Robert about bringing the grandkids for Christmas, and she had to keep asking him to speak up. Eventually, she just talked to me instead and asked me to fill Robert in later. Our own children were giving up on communicating with their father.
These ripple effects impact entire families.
That evening, I sat at the kitchen table thinking about our future. If Robert couldn't communicate during a medical emergency, how would we handle bigger challenges that Parkinson's might bring? What if he fell and couldn't call for help? What if he needed to tell me something important about his medication or symptoms? I felt like I was living with someone who was slowly disappearing, even though he was sitting right across from me every day.
Did you talk to anyone about what you were experiencing?
I called my sister that night. I told her I was thinking about taking a break, maybe staying with her for a while. She was shocked. She said, Linda, the man has Parkinson's disease. You can't leave him now. But I tried to explain that it wasn't about the Parkinson's. It was about feeling like I was married to someone who didn't want to talk to me anymore.
People assume if someone can physically speak, they're choosing not to. But hypophonia, soft speech, is completely involuntary.
I didn't know there was a medical term for it. I thought it was just Robert being Robert. Stubborn, withdrawn, maybe depressed about his diagnosis.
Here's what's crucial for families to understand. Hypophonia affects about 90% of people with Parkinson's disease, but it's often the symptom families struggle with most because it feels personal. Unlike a tremor or slow movement, voice changes seem like something the person should be able to control.
Exactly. If Robert's hand was shaking, I knew that was the Parkinson's. But when he whispered during conversations, it felt like a choice he was making about our relationship.
The morning after the hospital visit, you woke up with a decision about your marriage. But what you didn't know was that Robert had been fighting a neurological war where his brain was betraying his desire to communicate with you. Linda's breaking point came 2 days later, but what happened next would completely change her understanding of the man she'd been married to for 38 years. Linda, tell me about that conversation with Dr. Patricia Chen.
I'd called Robert's neurologist, desperate for answers. I told Dr. Chen that I couldn't communicate with my husband anymore, and it was destroying our marriage. I expected her to suggest counseling or medication adjustment. Instead, she said something that stopped me cold. "Mrs. Martinez, has anyone explained hypophonia to you?"
What did she tell you about hypophonia?
She said Robert's brain literally cannot tell the difference between whispering and shouting. When he thinks he's speaking loudly, his voice might actually be getting softer. The same dopamine loss causing his hand tremor was affecting his throat muscles, breathing, even his ability to hear his own voice.
Hypophonia affects the brain's entire speech feedback system. When someone asks a Parkinson's patient to speak louder, their brain genuinely believes they're already speaking loudly.
Dr. Chen asked me to think back over the past year. Had I noticed Robert's voice getting softer gradually? Changes in his facial expression? Less smiling? Fewer animated gestures? Had his handwriting gotten smaller?
What did you realize?
Everything clicked. About 2 years ago, I'd started asking Robert to sign important documents because his signature had become so small. His Christmas cards to the grandkids went from cheerful notes to just his name.
Small handwriting micrographia is caused by the same motor control issues affecting speech.
Dr. Chen said something that really hit me. Your husband isn't choosing to whisper any more than he's choosing to have his hand shake. Both are symptoms of the same neurological process. I started crying right there on the phone because I realized I'd been angry at Robert for something he couldn't control.
How did this change your perspective on those months of frustration?
I felt horrible. All those dinners eaten in silence because I was too frustrated to keep asking what. I'd been punishing him for being sick, but I also felt relieved because our marriage problems weren't relationship problems. They were medical problems.
Tell me about going home and talking to Robert with this new understanding.
That evening, I sat down with Robert and told him about Dr. Chen. I apologized for not understanding. I asked how long he'd been aware his voice was getting softer. He looked at me with tears and whispered, "I didn't know either. I thought you were losing your hearing."
Both of you were experiencing the same communication breakdown from completely different perspectives.
Robert told me he'd been trying so hard to speak clearly that it exhausted him. Some days he'd avoid conversations because the effort was wearing him out. When I'd ask him to speak up, he'd try harder, but his brain would tell his muscles to work less. The harder he tried, the quieter he got.
Traditional speech therapy often fails with Parkinson's. The try harder approach works against the neurological reality. Specialized programs like LSVT retrain the brain's perception of loudness.
Dr. Chen explained that Robert's voice patterns were tied to his medication schedule. Morning dopamine levels made his voice stronger. By evening, as medication wore off, hypophonia returned.
Parkinson's voice changes follow predictable patterns tied to brain chemistry. Understanding these patterns helps you communicate more effectively and reduces frustration.
Looking back, I could see signs everywhere. Robert had stopped answering the phone, stopped going to church because singing had become impossible. Our social circle was shrinking because conversations were too difficult.
These behavioral changes that families often attribute to depression are actually adaptive responses to a communication disorder. Patients aren't becoming antisocial. They're protecting themselves from situations where they can't communicate effectively.
The most heartbreaking part was when Robert told me he'd been afraid I was going to leave him. He could see me getting more frustrated every day and he didn't know how to fix it. He'd been considering asking our daughter to help him find somewhere else to live so I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore.
Hypophonia often goes undiagnosed for years. Only 3% of Parkinson's patients receive proper speech therapy, yet 90% experience voice problems. Millions of families are struggling with communication issues they don't know are treatable medical symptoms.
Once I understood what was happening in Robert's brain, I had to learn an entirely new way of communicating with my husband. But that knowledge saved our marriage.
Linda, what was the first change you made?
Dr. Chen referred us to a speech therapist who specialized in Parkinson's. But before our first appointment, I changed one simple thing. Instead of asking Robert to speak louder when I couldn't hear him, I learned to move closer to him. Instead of trying to fix his voice, I fixed our distance.
Perfect example of accommodation versus compensation. Rather than forcing Robert to overcome neurological limitations, you adapted the environment.
The speech therapist taught us about LSVT, Lee Silverman voice treatment. Instead of telling Robert to speak louder, it teaches him to think big with his voice. The therapy retrains the brain to recalibrate what normal volume feels like.
LSVT works with the brain's neuroplasticity. Instead of conscious volume control, patients learn to engage their entire respiratory and vocal system differently. How did Robert respond?
The first few sessions were hard for him. 30 years as an electrician, Robert was used to fixing things with his hands, not his voice. But our therapist, Maria, was incredible. She had Robert practice speaking while doing physical movements, reaching overhead, pushing against walls. Bigger movements help trigger bigger voice.
That's the beauty of LSVT. It connects voice production to whole-body movement patterns that Parkinson's patients can still access.
Within 3 weeks, I started hearing my husband's real voice again. Not every day and not all day, but enough to have actual conversations. The first time he spoke loudly enough for me to hear him from across the room, I started crying.
What other strategies did you develop?
We invested in a small voice amplifier. It's like a tiny microphone that clips to his shirt with a small speaker. It cost about $40 on Amazon. For Robert, it was life-changing because he could hear his own voice amplified, which helped his brain recalibrate volume control.
Technology can be helpful when used alongside proper therapy. What about daily communication habits?
We developed signals. If I can't hear Robert, instead of saying, "What?" I tap my ear. That way he knows it's a volume issue, not that I'm not paying attention. If he's having a difficult voice day, he'll point to his throat and I know to come closer or ask yes or no questions instead of open-ended ones.
These adaptations show how couples can maintain connection even when traditional communication methods are compromised.
The speech therapist also taught us about timing conversations around Robert's medication schedule. His voice is strongest about an hour after he takes his morning dose, so that's when we discuss important things. Doctor appointments, family plans, anything that requires back and forth conversation.
That's using medical knowledge to optimize daily life. What surprised you most about this process?
I discovered that Robert had actually become a much better listener because speaking was so difficult for him. Our conversations became more meaningful because we both had to be more intentional about when and how we communicated. In some ways, we became closer than we'd been in years.
Many couples report that working through communication challenges actually strengthens their relationship because it requires more patience, creativity, and mutual understanding.
We also found alternatives to verbal communication. Robert started texting me when he was in another room instead of trying to call out to me. We got a small whiteboard for the kitchen where he could write quick notes if his voice was particularly soft that day.
Those are excellent adaptive strategies. How did these changes affect your social life?
We started being more selective about social situations, but in a good way. Instead of avoiding restaurants entirely, we chose quieter places or went during off-peak hours. Robert practiced ordering his meal at home so he could speak more confidently to servers. Our friends learned to give him time to respond in conversations.
What advice would you give to other families dealing with similar communication challenges?
First, get educated. Don't assume voice changes are behavioral or emotional. Second, find a speech therapist who understands Parkinson's. Not all of them do. Third, be patient with each other. Robert was learning to communicate with a compromised neurological system, and I was learning to be a different kind of communication partner.
Technology and therapy options for Parkinson's voice issues have improved dramatically. Voice amplifiers, specialized apps that provide real-time volume feedback, and experimental treatments using vocal fold injections are helping patients maintain clearer communication longer.
What I wish I'd known earlier is that this isn't about going backward to how things used to be. It's about moving forward with new ways of connecting. Robert and I have a different kind of communication now, but it's not a lesser kind. Sometimes I think we understand each other better than we did before all this started.
That transformation from crisis to deeper understanding shows how the biggest change wasn't in the tools Linda and Robert used. It was in how they redefined what love sounds like when words become whispers. 6 months after Linda considered divorce, they've built a completely new foundation for their marriage. Linda, how would you describe your relationship today?
It's deeper than it's ever been. When you have to work harder to communicate, every conversation becomes more intentional. Robert chooses his words more carefully because speaking takes effort. I listen more closely because I know how much it costs him to share his thoughts with me.
You've mentioned that silence has become a different experience for you both.
Before, silence felt like rejection. Now, sometimes we'll sit together for an hour reading or watching TV, and the quiet feels comfortable. I know it's not that Robert doesn't want to talk. Sometimes his voice just needs to rest. When he does speak, I know he really wants to share whatever he's saying.
What would you tell a wife who called you today saying she's at the breaking point you were at 6 months ago?
I'd tell her it's not her fault that she's frustrated, and it's not her husband's fault that his voice is changing. Get medical answers first before you make emotional decisions. Find out if what you're experiencing has a name and a treatment plan. Most importantly, remember that the person you married is still there. He just might need new ways to show you.
Has Robert's perspective on his own communication changed?
Completely. Before we understood hypophonia, Robert felt like he was failing as a husband because he couldn't make himself understood. He was working so hard to speak clearly that conversations exhausted him. Now he knows it's okay to use his amplifier, to text me instead of calling across the house, to save his voice for conversations that matter most.
What do you want other families to know about the journey you've been through?
That it's okay to grieve the easy communication you used to have. Robert and I had 36 years of effortless conversation before Parkinson's changed the rules. It's normal to miss that, but don't let grief keep you from discovering what's possible with patience and the right tools.
You mentioned your grandchildren earlier. How have they adapted to their grandfather's voice changes?
Kids are amazing. Our 8-year-old granddaughter, Emma, figured out that Grandpa talks better when she sits close to him. Now when she visits, she automatically curls up next to Robert when she wants to tell him about school. She doesn't see it as a problem to solve, just how Grandpa communicates.
What advice do you have for extended family members?
Don't give up on conversation just because it's harder. Don't talk around the person with Parkinson's like they're not there. Ask them directly what communication strategies work best. Some days, Robert prefers written questions he can answer verbally. Other days, yes or no questions work better.
Looking ahead, how are you preparing for potential progression of Robert's symptoms?
We're staying connected with our speech therapist for regular check-ins. Robert continues his LSVT exercises daily, not just when he's having voice problems, but as maintenance. We've also started learning about assistive technology that might help in the future, like voice banking software.
What's the most important thing you've learned about love through this experience?
That love isn't about perfect communication, it's about persistent communication. It's about adapting when things change instead of insisting they stay the same. Robert shows me he loves me by working hard to share his thoughts, even when it's difficult. I show him I love him by creating space for whatever voice he has that day.
For our Health SOS community, Linda's story illustrates something crucial. The symptoms that seem most behavioral are often the most medical. Voice changes in Parkinson's aren't personality changes. They're neurological changes that have medical solutions.
If someone watching this recognizes their own family situation, please don't wait like I did. Talk to your doctor. Ask specifically about speech therapy for Parkinson's. Get the medical education you need to understand what's happening. Your relationship might depend on it.
The statistics are sobering. 90% of Parkinson's patients experience voice problems, but fewer than 4% receive proper speech therapy. That means millions of families are struggling with communication breakdowns that could be addressed with the right medical support.
I almost threw away 38 years of marriage because I didn't understand that my husband's whispers were symptoms, not choices. I don't want other wives to make that mistake.
If Linda and Robert's story resonated with you, please subscribe to Health SOS for more real family medical stories that could protect your loved ones. Share this episode with anyone who might be dealing with communication changes they don't understand. Because sometimes the most important medical information comes from one family's courage to share their truth.
The person you love is still there, even when their voice changes. You just have to learn a new language of listening.
For Health SOS, I'm Dr. Ellis Grant. Remember, real people, real warnings. Every family's medical story matters, and sharing knowledge saves relationships. Until next time, listen closely to the people you love, because sometimes the most important things are said in whispers.